I walked in as my wife and friends laughed over rules for me. I turned one fairness rule and a phone threat into cold, quiet divorce revenge now. The kind of warm, welcoming laughter you'd expect from your wife having friends over. This was different, sharp, mocking, the kind that makes your gut twist because you know somehow that you're the punchline of a joke you haven't heard yet. I pushed the door open, and the scene in my living room made everything clear. 5 women sitting in a circle like some twisted book club, notebooks and pens scattered across my coffee table, all of them red-faced from laughing so hard. My wife was right in the center, holding what looked like a handwritten list, gesturing dramatically as she read from it. "And number 12, she announced between giggles. "He has to ask permission before buying anything over $20. The group erupted again, one of them actually slapping her knee like this was the funniest thing she'd heard all year. I stood there for a moment, still holding my keys, watching my wife perform for her audience. This wasn't the woman I married. The woman I married had opinions of her own, didn't need a committee to validate every thought. But here she was, playing ringleader to this circus, feeding off their approval like some kind of validation vampire. "Oh, look, speak of the devil," one of the friends chirped when she noticed me. The others turned, and suddenly I was the center of attention. Not in a good way, more like a specimen under a microscope. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing you." My wife's face lit up with excitement. "Come here, honey. The girls and I have been working on something really fun." She waved the list in the air like a trophy. "We're making a list of rules that would make marriages so much better. You know, guidelines for husbands to follow." The way she said guidelines made my blood pressure spike. These weren't suggestions. These weren't discussions between equals. These were commands wrapped up in the pretty packaging of friendship and female empowerment. I walked closer, noting how they all watched me like predators sizing up prey. They wanted a reaction. They expected me to either get angry and prove their point about men being unreasonable or submit and validate their little power game. "Rules?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "What kind of rules?" The friend sitting closest to my wife, a woman I'd met maybe 3 times, leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, we've got some really good ones, like mandatory date nights that he plans and pays for. No sports on television when we want to watch something else." And she paused for dramatic effect. "A weekly performance review where we grade how well he's doing as a husband." They all burst into laughter again, like this was the most brilliant idea ever conceived. My wife nodded enthusiastically, adding, "And if he fails the review, no privileges for a week." She made air quotes around privileges and winked at her friends. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity, crystal clear understanding of what was happening here. These women weren't just making jokes, they were serious. They genuinely believed they had the right to create a framework for controlling their husbands, and they were using each other to normalize it. "That's creative," I said, pulling up a chair to join their little circle. "Mind if I hear the complete list? I'm curious about the thought process behind this." My wife beamed, clearly interpreting my calm response as compliance. "Of course, we've been working on it for hours. We're up to number 18 so far." As she started reading from the beginning, I studied each face around the circle. These weren't strangers. These were women I'd welcomed into my home, cooked dinner for, made small talk with at various gatherings, and now they were sitting in my living room creating a manual for how to domesticate me. But here's what they didn't understand about me. What my wife seemed to have forgotten in her excitement to impress her friends. I don't break under pressure. I don't submit to unreasonable demands. And I definitely don't appreciate being humiliated in my own home. I was about to give them a lesson in consequences they'd never forget. My wife cleared her throat theatrically and began reading their masterpiece. Each rule was more insulting than the last, delivered with the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect from someone announcing lottery numbers. Rule 1. All major decisions require wife approval, including but not limited to career changes, large purchases, and social commitments. She looked up at me with raised eyebrows, as if checking whether I was properly absorbing this wisdom. The friend to her left jumped in. "Oh, and Rule 7 is my personal favorite. He has to give a daily gratitude speech about what his wife does for him, at least 2 minutes long." They all nodded sagely, like this was some profound relationship insight, instead of a humiliation ritual designed by people with too much time and too little self-awareness. Rule 11. Another friend continued, "No hanging out with single friends. They're a bad influence and might give him ideas about freedom." She emphasized the word freedom like it was something toxic. I sat back in my chair, fascinated by the psychology unfolding in front of me. These women had convinced themselves they were relationship experts when really they were just insecure control freaks, looking for validation from other insecure control freaks. "What about Rule 15? My wife asked the group, the one about his appearance. "Oh yes," the woman with the notebook responded eagerly. "He has to dress according to her preferences at all social events. No more embarrassing her with his fashion choices." The hypocrisy was staggering. Half these women showed up to neighborhood barbecues looking like they'd raided a teenager's closet, but apparently I needed fashion supervision. "And Rule 16, my wife added with particular glee, is about his hobbies. He can only pursue activities that either include her or somehow benefit the household. No more selfish interests." The group murmured their approval like a bunch of yes-men agreeing with a dictator. I watched my wife soak up their praise, completely transformed from the independent woman I'd married into someone who needed group approval for every thought. "What's Rule 18? I asked, genuinely curious how deep this rabbit hole went. The friend who'd been taking notes looked down at her paper. "Weekly allowance system. He gets spending money based on how well he followed the other rules that week. Good behavior gets rewarded. Bad behavior gets punished." They were talking about me like I was a child who needed behavioral modification in my own house while sitting 3 feet away from me. The disrespect was so casual, so normalized in their little echo chamber, that they didn't even recognize what they were doing. "And we're not done yet," my wife announced proudly. "We're thinking about adding rules for his family interactions, his work schedule, maybe even his diet." "Oh yes," another friend chimed in. "Men have no self-control when it comes to food. They need structure." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. "This is really comprehensive. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." My tone was conversational, almost appreciative. "Can I ask something, though?" "Of course," my wife said, practically glowing with pride. "How exactly would you enforce these rules? I mean, what happens if someone doesn't come?" The question seemed to energize them even more. They started talking over each other, eager to share their enforcement strategies. "Withholding privileges," one said. "Public embarrassment," suggested another. "Financial consequences," added a third. My wife nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And if he's really stubborn, we can always use social pressure. Get his friends' wives involved. Make it a community effort." There it was. The nuclear option. Turn the entire social circle into enforcers of their ridiculous rule system. Create a network of wives policing their husbands like some suburban surveillance state. "That's brilliant," I said, and I meant it. Not because the plan was good, but because they just revealed exactly how far they were willing to go, how little they respected not just me, but any man in their orbit. The friend with the notebook looked up from her writing. "We should make copies for everyone, start implementing these in our own marriages, and see how it goes." Like a test group, my wife agreed. We could meet weekly to compare notes, see which rules work best, maybe add new ones based on our experiences. I sat there listening to them plan the systematic dismantling of their marriages, all while congratulating themselves on their brilliance. They had no idea what they were about to unleash, no concept of how their little experiment was about to backfire in ways they couldn't imagine. But I knew because while they'd been busy creating their rulebook, I'd been formulating my own strategy. And unlike their elaborate system of micromanagement, mine was beautifully simple. One rule, that's all I needed. One rule that would expose the fundamental flaw in their entire philosophy and shut down their little power game permanently. They thought they were so clever, sitting there in their circle, crafting their perfect system of control. They had no idea they were about to learn the difference between making rules and enforcing them, between talking tough in a group and facing real consequences alone. The room had settled into a comfortable rhythm of mutual admiration, each woman taking turns to praise the other's contributions to their manifesto of marital control. My wife was practically glowing, clearly feeling like the leader of some revolutionary movement. The friend with the notebook said, clicking her pen with authority, "I think we should present the complete list to him now. Get his official response." She looked directly at me with the kind of condescending smile you'd give a child who was about to receive instructions. My wife clapped her hands together. Perfect timing. "Honey, we'd like to go through the entire list with you. Think of it as an orientation for your new and improved marriage." The other women giggled at this, clearly delighted with the phrasing. They arranged themselves like a tribunal, notebooks ready, pens poised to record my reactions. They expected compliance, maybe some weak protests they could easily dismiss, followed by reluctant acceptance of their authority. I appreciate the effort you've all put into this, I said, settling back in my chair like I was getting comfortable for a long presentation. Before we go through the list, though, I want to make sure I understand the framework correctly. This seemed to please them. My wife nodded encouragingly, probably thinking I was finally taking their project seriously. So, these rules apply to husbands specifically? I asked. That's right, the notebook woman confirmed. Men need more structure in relationships. It's just how they're wired. And the enforcement mechanisms you mentioned, those would be implemented by the wives. Exactly, my wife said proudly. We're taking charge of creating healthier dynamics. I nodded thoughtfully, as if processing this profound wisdom. What about accountability on the other side? Are there any rules or standards that the wives need to follow? The question seemed to catch them off guard. They exchanged glances, clearly not having considered this angle. Well, one of them said slowly, wives naturally regulate themselves. We don't need external rules because we're already relationship-focused. The arrogance was breathtaking. They'd convinced themselves that they were inherently superior partners who needed no oversight, while their husbands were defective humans requiring constant management. That makes sense, I said agreeably. So, this is essentially a one-way system. Wives create rules, husbands follow them, and there's no reciprocal structure. Right, my wife confirmed, though she looked slightly uncertain about my line of questioning. I leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Can I ask how you came up with these specific rules? Did you survey your husbands about what they thought would improve your marriages? The silence that followed was telling. Of course, they hadn't consulted anyone. This wasn't about improving marriages. This was about feeding their egos and establishing dominance through group validation. We base them on our experiences, one friend finally said. We know what works, and your husband's experiences. Did those factor into the decision-making process? My wife was starting to look uncomfortable. This isn't really about their experiences. It's about creating structure. Structure, I repeated, tasting the word. So, you're saying that your collective wisdom is sufficient to determine what's best for all the marriages represented here? They were nodding, but less enthusiastically now. My questions were poking holes in their confidence, making them defend positions they hadn't really thought through. That's a significant responsibility, I continued, making unilateral decisions that affect other people's relationships. I'm impressed by your confidence in taking that on. The friend with the notebook shifted uncomfortably. We're not making decisions for other people. We're just offering suggestions. Suggestions, I said, glancing at their list with enforcement mechanisms and consequences for non-compliance. That sounds more like legislation than suggestions. My wife was definitely feeling the shift in momentum now. Why are you being so analytical about this? It's supposed to be helpful. I want to make sure I fully understand what you're proposing, I said reasonably. Because once we implement a system like this, it changes the fundamental nature of the relationship. I want to be certain everyone has thought through all the implications. The group was getting restless. This wasn't how they'd expected this conversation to go. They'd anticipated either immediate compliance or easily dismissed objections. They weren't prepared for systematic questioning of their entire premise. Look, my wife said with forced patience. We've put a lot of work into this. The least you could do is listen to the rules with an open mind. Absolutely, I agreed. But I think it's only fair that if I'm going to be subject to 18 rules created without my input, I should be allowed to contribute one rule of my own to the system. The room went quiet. They hadn't expected this. In their worldview, I was supposed to be a passive recipient of their wisdom, not an active participant in rulemaking. What kind of rule? My wife asked cautiously. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Just one simple rule that I think would make the whole system more balanced and fair. After all, if we're going to restructure marriage dynamics, shouldn't it be a collaborative effort? The trap was set. They could hardly refuse without admitting their system was designed to be one-sided and unfair. But agreeing to hear my rule meant opening the door to consequences they couldn't imagine. My wife looked around at her friends, seeking guidance from her support group. They were all watching me now with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Fine, she said finally. One rule, then we go through our list. Perfect. They had no idea they'd just agreed to their own demolition. I stood up slowly, taking my time, letting the anticipation build in the room. The women watched me with a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. They sensed something had shifted but couldn't quite identify what. First, let me say how impressed I am with your dedication to improving marriages. I began pacing slightly as I spoke. 18 Rules is thorough, really thorough. It shows you've given this serious thought. My wife perked up slightly at the praise, though her friends looked more skeptical. They were starting to realize that my calm acceptance might not be the victory they'd assumed. My rule is much simpler than yours, I continued, stopping to face the group directly. Just one sentence, really. Easy to remember, easy to implement. The friend with the notebook had her pen ready, prepared to add my contribution to their master document. Go ahead, she said with barely concealed impatience. I clasped my hands behind my back, adopting the posture of someone about to deliver important information. Any woman who participates in creating rules to control her husband is automatically declaring herself available for the same treatment from other men. The silence was immediate and complete. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. The smiles faded from their faces as the implications of what I just said began to sink in. What does that mean exactly? My wife asked, though her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. It means, I said, maintaining my conversational tone, that by establishing the principle that spouses can unilaterally create binding rules for each other, you've opened the door for reciprocal treatment. If it's acceptable for you to make rules for me, then it's acceptable for me to make rules for you. The woman with the notebook was shaking her head. That's not the same thing at all. Isn't it? I asked genuinely. You just spent an hour explaining how husbands need structure and oversight, how they can't be trusted to make good decisions without guidance. Well, I'm applying that same logic to wives who think they have the authority to redesign other people's marriages without consultation. My wife was starting to look panicked. This was just a fun exercise. We weren't being serious, really. I picked up their notebook and flipped through the pages of carefully written rules complete with enforcement strategies and implementation timelines. This looks pretty serious to me. Multiple pages of detailed regulations, punishment systems, even plans for community enforcement. That's not the kind of thing people do for fun. The friend who'd suggested the weekly performance reviews was backpedaling fast. We were just brainstorming. It wasn't meant to be taken literally. Interesting, I said, setting the notebook back down. Because when you were explaining how to withhold privileges and use social pressure to enforce compliance, it sounded very literal to me. I walked back to my chair but didn't sit down. Instead, I leaned against it casually, like we were having a pleasant conversation about the weather. Here's what I find fascinating, I continued. You all seem to think that creating rules for husbands was not only acceptable but necessary. You were excited about it, energized by the idea of having that kind of control. But the moment I suggest the same approach might apply to you, suddenly it's unreasonable. The room was getting smaller by the second. These women who'd been so confident in their authority just minutes ago were now fidgeting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. So let me clarify my rule, I said, straightening up. Any woman who believes she has the right to create behavioral guidelines for her husband has automatically consented to having behavioral guidelines created for her. It's only fair, right? Equal treatment and all that. My wife found her voice, though it came out smaller than before. You can't be serious about this. Why not? I asked with genuine curiosity. You were serious about yours. You had 18 rules ready to implement, complete with consequences for non-compliance. You were planning to share this system with other wives, create a whole network of enforcement. That sounds pretty serious to me. The friend who'd been most vocal about the enforcement strategies was staring at her hands. It's different when it's the other way around. How so? I pressed. Please explain the difference. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you think rules and control are great ideas when you're the ones wielding the power, but suddenly become unfair when someone else might have that same power over you. No one had an answer for that. They couldn't explain why their authority was legitimate while mine was not, without admitting the whole thing was about dominance rather than improvement. I let the silence stretch for a moment before delivering the final piece of my strategy. Now, since we're all about fairness and structure here, I think your husbands should have the opportunity to review your rulemaking project. They should know that their wives have been meeting to create systems for controlling them. Don't you think they deserve that transparency? The panic in the room was palpable now. These women who'd been so bold about managing their husbands suddenly looked terrified at the thought of their husbands finding out what they'd been planning. You wouldn't, my wife whispered. I smiled, the kind of smile that conveyed complete certainty about what was going to happen next. Watch me. I pulled out my phone with the casual confidence of someone about to order pizza. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. 5 women who'd been smugly confident moments before were now staring at my phone like it was a loaded weapon. Wait, the friend with the notebook said, her voice climbing an octave. You don't need to involve anyone else in this. Why not? I asked, scrolling through my contacts. You were just talking about community enforcement, getting other wives involved to make sure the rules stick. I'm just expanding the community to include the husbands. My wife lunged forward like she was going to grab my phone. Please don't do this. It'll ruin everything. Ruin what exactly? I asked, holding the phone just out of her reach. I thought this was about improving marriages. Shouldn't improving marriages be something husbands would want to know about? The woman who'd suggested the daily gratitude speeches was practically hyperventilating. My husband will kill me if he finds out about this. Kill you? I raised an eyebrow. That seems like an extreme reaction to finding out his wife wants to improve their marriage. Unless, of course, he wouldn't see it as improvement. I found the first contact I was looking for. Her husband worked with me occasionally on neighborhood projects. Nice guy. Probably had no idea his wife spent her free time plotting his behavioral modification. Let's start with Dave, I said, showing the screen to his wife. He seems like the type who'd appreciate transparency in his marriage. No, she practically shrieked. He'll think I'm crazy. Why would he think you're crazy? I asked innocently. These are just helpful suggestions for creating a better partnership, right? The friend who'd been so enthusiastic about financial control was backing toward the door. I should probably get going. This isn't really my business anyway. Oh, but it is your business, I said, turning my attention to her. You contributed Rule 14 about the allowance system. Your husband should know you think he needs financial supervision. She froze halfway to the door, caught between wanting to flee and not wanting to make sudden movements that might trigger me to actually make the call. My wife was in full panic mode now. Look, we can forget the whole thing. Just put the phone away and we'll pretend this never happened. Pretend what never happened? I asked. The part where you and your friends spent hours creating a system to control and humiliate your husbands, or the part where you plan to implement it without their knowledge or consent? The notebook friend was trying a different approach. We were just venting. You know how women get together and complain about their husbands. It's normal. Is it normal to create detailed enforcement strategies? I asked, picking up their notebook again. Because this looks less like venting and more like a business plan for domestic tyranny. I started reading from their notes. Weekly performance reviews with grading systems, privilege revocation for non-compliance, social pressure campaigns involving other couples. This isn't venting. This is systematic planning. The woman who'd suggested the appearance rules was wringing her hands. Please, my husband is already suspicious about my girls' nights. If he finds out we were talking about controlling him, he'll never let me come to another one. Let you, I repeated. That's interesting phrasing. It sounds like your husband already understands the concept of setting boundaries in a relationship. I held up my phone again, finger hovering over Dave's contact. You know what? I think I'll call him first. Get his perspective on Rule 13 about mandatory household chores. Stop, his wife shouted. I'll do anything. Please don't call him. The desperation in her voice was exactly what I'd been waiting for. These women who'd been so eager to exercise power over their husbands were completely falling apart at the thought of facing any consequences for their actions. Anything? I asked. That's a big word. What exactly are you offering? She looked around at her friends for support, but they were all too busy trying to save their own situations to help her. I'll throw away the notebook. We'll never talk about this again. That's a start, I acknowledged. But it doesn't address the fundamental problem here. You all thought you had the right to redesign your marriages without consulting your partners. That's not a notebook problem. That's a respect problem. My wife was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. I'm sorry, I got carried away. The girls were so excited about the idea, and I wanted to fit in. There it was. The truth behind the whole pathetic display. She'd Aziz been willing to humiliate me and damage our marriage just to impress a group of women who were probably talking behind her back the moment she left the room. Fit in, I repeated slowly. You were willing to destroy your husband's dignity to fit in with people who convinced you that controlling your spouse was normal behavior. The friend who'd been taking notes was edging toward the door again. Maybe we should all just go home and forget this happened. Oh no, I said firmly, we're not done here. You all participated in creating this system. You all need to understand why it was wrong and what the consequences could have been. I looked around the room at 5 women who'd gone from confident controllers to terrified conspirators in the span of 20 minutes. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice carrying the absolute authority they'd been so eager to exercise over their husbands. You're going to sit down and you're going to listen while I explain exactly how this is going to be resolved. None of them moved toward the door. They knew they were trapped. And they knew I held all the cards now. The power dynamic they'd been so excited to establish had been completely reversed, and they were about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone else's rules. The 5 women sat down reluctantly, looking like defendants waiting for their sentences. The transformation was complete. 30 minutes ago, they'd been the judges, jury, and executioners of marital behavior. Now they couldn't even make eye contact with me. I put my phone face down on the coffee table where they could all see it. The threat was still there, but I wanted their full attention for what came next. Let me explain something about respect, I began, standing in front of their little circle. Respect isn't something you can legislate. You can't create rules that force someone to respect you. Respect is earned through your actions and lost through your choices. My wife wiped her eyes with a tissue but kept her head down. The others were equally subdued, finally understanding they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Today, you all made a choice. You chose to spend your time creating ways to diminish and control your husbands. You chose to prioritize your own egos over your marriages. You chose to see your partners as projects to be managed rather than equals to be respected. The friend who'd been so excited about the weekly allowance system spoke up quietly. We didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did, I said without hesitation. You meant exactly like that. You were excited about having that level of control. You laughed about it. You planned ways to enforce it. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was innocent. I walked over to their notebook and held it up. This represents hours of planning, detailed strategies for manipulation and control. You didn't accidentally stumble into this. You chose it and you were proud of it until you realized there might be consequences. The woman who'd suggested the appearance rules was crying silently. Her husband was a good man who worked 2 jobs to support their family. The idea that she'd been planning to humiliate him with performance reviews and behavioral modification was probably hitting her like a truck. Here's what's going to happen now, I continued, tearing the first page out of their notebook. This stops today. Not just the notebook, but the entire mindset that created it. I tore another page, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. You're going to go home to your husbands, and you're going to remember why you married them. Not their potential, not who you think they could become with proper management, who they actually are. Another page hit the floor. My wife was watching me destroy their manifesto with something that looked like relief. And if any of you ever again think it's appropriate to sit around creating systems for controlling your spouse, you're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember how it felt when someone else held that kind of power over you. I tore out the last few pages and let them scatter. Because that phone call I threatened to make? That was nothing compared to what would have happened if you'd actually tried to implement this garbage. The notebook friend finally looked up at me. What do you mean? I mean, your husbands aren't idiots, I said bluntly. They would have figured out what was happening. And then you would have found out what it really looks like when a man decides he's done with disrespect and manipulation. I sat back down but maintained eye contact with each of them. You want to know the difference between men and women when it comes to relationship conflicts? When women get upset, they plot and scheme and create support groups to validate their feelings. When men get upset, they just leave. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These women had been playing with fire, thinking they were safe because they had each other's approval. They hadn't considered what would happen when their victims decided they'd had enough. My wife, I said, looking directly at her, is going to make a choice right now. She can continue down this path of thinking she knows better than me about how our marriage should work, or she can remember that marriage is a partnership between equals. My wife looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I choose partnership, she whispered. Good, I said, because the alternative was me choosing to find a partner who actually respected me. I stood up and walked to the front door, opening it wide. Ladies, this has been educational, but I think it's time for you to go home and reflect on what you've learned today. They filed out quietly, most of them unable to look at me as they passed. The woman who'd been taking notes paused at the door. Are you going to tell their husbands about this? She asked nervously. That depends, I said. Are you going to give me a reason to? She shook her head quickly and hurried out to her car. My wife was the last one standing in the living room, looking lost and ashamed. We stood there for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling between us. I'm sorry, she said finally. I don't know what I was thinking. You were thinking you could get away with disrespecting me because you had backup, I said calmly. You were thinking that as long as other people validated your behavior, it was acceptable. She nodded, tears starting again. How do we fix this? We fix it by you understanding that this marriage works because we respect each other, I said. The moment you decided I needed to be managed and controlled was the moment you stopped being my partner and started being my adversary. I walked over to where the torn pages lay scattered on the floor. Help me clean this up, and while we're doing it, you can explain to me how you're going to make sure something like this never happens again. As we knelt together, picking up the pieces of their ridiculous rule book, I realized this had been more than just shutting down a power grab. It had been a reminder of who I was and what I was willing to accept in my life. Some people think being a good husband means being accommodating to the point of self-destruction. But real strength isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about standing up for yourself when the people who should respect you most try to tear you down. My wife learned that lesson today, and more importantly, so did I.